Okay. So that being said, why do we need to think about Muslims as a specific group of interest or concern or vulnerabilities? Now, when we're thinking about Muslim young people, they tend to be a socially, culturally, economically, and politically diverse group. So they come from multiple different backgrounds, like Sabah was saying earlier, in terms of the prevalences that we say with regards to poverty, as well as sort of different languages that young Muslims may speak, and also importantly that they may differ in their practices of Islamic values as well. We understand that approximately 48% of young Muslims are reported to be under the age of 25. So again, if we refer back to the previous slide where I was discussing some of the prevalences and the statistics, we can see that a significant proportion of these young people may potentially also be Muslim. With approximately 300,000 Muslim teenagers living in the UK in 2021, we know that this is a population who may in the future need mental health service provisions, and consequently highlights the need and the importance for us to begin to understand not only the prevalences and the vulnerabilities, but also to get a slightly better understanding of some of the etiologies of the development of mental health problems amongst Muslim young people. So what are some of these vulnerabilities? How may they be manifesting themselves over time? And what is the support network that young Muslims currently have? In addition, this is particularly pertinent to those who are working within the education and public health sectors, because we know from research that members of ethnic minority groups are least likely to uptake mental health services. They're more likely to experience stigma and barriers when it comes to seeking help and support. So with this all in mind, it kind of begins for us to get an understanding of why we think young Muslims would be particularly vulnerable and need the attention. So that being said, why do we think Muslim young people are particularly vulnerable? So like I mentioned earlier, there's a whole list of literature which suggests adverse childhood experiences, which are applicable to as a risk factor for all young people, so not just only specific to young Muslims. But nonetheless, there is a heightened, well, I should say there's a potential heightened vulnerability amongst young Muslims for a number of reasons. Firstly, when we're thinking about heterogeneity, young Muslims belong to a heterogeneous group. So this includes them thinking about differences or trying to maintain different identities with regards to culture, religion, language, ethnic statuses collectively. They're also quite heterogeneous when we think about appearances as well, so how they may practice their religious beliefs, may that be through their chosen attire, for example. Young Muslims are also under particular pressure when it comes to acculturation. So again, trying to maintain a balance between the identity that they have in maintaining a traditional identity, but also adapting to the challenges or the norms which are considered to be British values and ideologies. And at moments, this can be slightly challenging or problematic due to the fact that some British norms or values may at first seem to be in conflict with some of the traditional or religious practices and values that young Muslims grow up with. Another example is prejudice and violence. So for example, a report by the organization Tell Mama in 2019 reported that there were approximately 3,000 accounts of anti-Muslim hate crimes which were delivered or which young Muslims were exposed to. In addition to that, we know that with other forms of violence, such as trauma and domestic violence or intimate partner violence, for example, we know that there are heightened vulnerabilities and heightened prevalences amongst certain minority groups, such as South Asians, and amongst South Asians, a large proportion or a significant proportion belong or identify as Muslim. Furthermore, there are a number of other traumas, such as displacement and migration due to exposure to environments or home countries where they've been exposed to natural disasters and war as well. So collectively, we can begin to see that in addition to some of the challenges that young people overall are facing in the UK today, Muslim young people may have a slightly higher exposure to some of these vulnerabilities, which may contribute towards poorer mental health. So that being said, surprisingly, the literature which is beginning to show some of these differences or show some of these prevalences of mental health problems amongst young Muslims is quite limited within the UK specifically. So traditionally, studies which have explored differences or disparities in mental health conditions and symptoms have primarily come from studies which have focused on ethnic minority groups. Now, although ethnic minority groups do include groups which may predominantly identify themselves as being Muslim, it's important to note that religion and ethnicity are not synonyms of one another. And by sort of trying to extrapolate conclusions from literature or data which is focusing on ethnic minority groups, doesn't take into consideration that heterogeneity that I was making reference to earlier, or the complexity of the different identities and roles that young Muslims are facing. The literature is mixed to some extent, whereby there is some evidence to actually suggest that there may be a potential protective role. So some early evidence from researchers in the United Kingdom suggests that the mental health of white British adolescents is actually poorer than that of their ethnic minority peers, that Muslim adolescents tend to have lower levels of psychological distress, as measured by symptoms of depression, anxiety, and behavioral problems, and that globally, Muslim children tend to report high levels of subjective well-being. So this may be in relation to satisfaction with life as a whole, your general satisfaction with your family and your friends in comparison to other religious groups. Now, this is completely contrary to what we've been talking about earlier and the introduction that Sabah was given. And there may be a number of reasons for this. So I'd just like to spend a little bit of time, if I may, just going through a little bit of data just to show evidence for exactly what Sabah was saying earlier on, is that there seems to be some differences with regards to prevalences in mental health. So here we see a couple of graphs, and this is data taken from the Determinants of Adolescent Social Wellbeing and Health study, so the DASH study. This is a cohort of just over 6,000 young people living in London in 2002 and 2003, so slightly dated, but nonetheless still important, whereby just under 20% identified themselves as being Muslim. What we see here, so we have a graph which is looking at mean levels of mental health problems, and then we have a graph which is looking at prevalences of mental health problems. And if I can first draw your attention to the graph which is looking at the mean levels of mental health problems, what we see here is we have a standardized measure of mental health problems, which include emotional problems, conduct problems, hyperactivity, peer problems, and prosocial behaviors. And these are just collected using standardized psychometric tests. And what we actually see to begin with is actually there's no significant difference between Muslims and non-Muslims when we're thinking about these rates of mental health problems. When we're thinking about prevalences in terms of the belonging to groups which are more borderline or diagnostic of clinical diagnosis of mental health problems, we see that there is a significant difference on the graph on the right-hand side, where young Muslims are actually reporting lower levels of conduct problems, lower levels of hyperactivity, but greater problems of peer problems. So greater levels of peer problems. So why is this important and what am I trying to say? Firstly, the evidence which is suggesting that young Muslims may potentially be protected is not being supported by this data. Now, this data specifically is looking at religious identity, and it's not making the assumption based on ethnicity. So that's an important factor to bear in mind. Secondly, when we're thinking about clinical diagnoses or prevalence differences, we see that there is a significant difference with regards to peer problems. Now, this fits in very nicely, well, I say nicely, loosely. This fits in with the literature or the idea in terms of that young Muslims are more likely to report elevated levels of bullying or discrimination based upon their faith. And they're also more likely to experience difficulties in peer problems and developing peer relationships based upon some of the conflicts that they may have with regards to their identity. That being said, there's also evidence, so these are reports that you as a group will be familiar with, which were reported by the BCBN and Muslim Youth Helpline. Now, these reports are with slightly older young people, but nonetheless, they're still beginning to demonstrate that there are prevalences of mental health problems amongst this group of individuals. So we see rates of about 50 to 60% suffer from anxiety, 18 to 30% suffer from self-harm and suicidality, and then 50% suffer from depression. So collectively, some of the issues that we're having, or some of the challenges that we're having, is that based upon the measures that are used to capture mental health, based upon the populations and the methods that are used in terms of the testing, whether it's a self-report or a psychometric test, etc., all seem to be contributing towards this slightly mixed picture that we have about the true or the presentation of mental health problems amongst young Muslims. So that being said, I think one of the things I would like to just draw our attention to is some of the challenges in this. So based upon the vulnerabilities and the literature about adverse experiences, etc., we know that young people, which includes Muslim young people, are at a heightened risk of developing mental health problems. We know the impact that mental health problems have in terms of productivity, employability, general well-being, mortality rates, etc. So all collectively emphasizing the need for us to understand the prevalences and the manifestations and the trajectories of mental health problems amongst young Muslims. But the challenges that we have is that currently the data from the UK primarily focuses on ethnicity, and I've discussed some of the problems with that. We also have data which, the more emerging data seems to be coming from surveys. Now, although surveys are a really useful tool for us to begin discussions and have a snapshot view, they do have their problems associated with them. Primarily, many of them tend to use single items, and we know that that's slightly problematic because that then brings into consideration a proportion of subjectivity, also biases with regards to how data is being reported, so self-selection with regards to sampling, opportunity and convenience sampling, so certain people are more likely to respond and partake in these sorts of surveys, and that by default means that we may not be capturing everybody who we would like to. What this collectively highlights or is indicating for us is the need for larger longitudinal cohort data. And apologies here, I come with a slight bias in that I am a researcher who works with longitudinal cohort data, and I understand I will always have a slight bias towards this method. But it's a useful tool, and it's a useful tool because our current understanding about mental health problems in young people in the UK and universally at the moment comes from longitudinal large cohort data, which explores and captures these different developmental trajectories of mental health problems, explores the complexities about their manifestations and how they change over time. And what I'm trying to say here is that we need something similar for young Muslim people. So we need something similar where we can then begin to use similar standardized measures, so such as the STQs, which is a strengths difficulties questionnaire or a behavior checklist, etc., which we can then use to compare rates of mental health problems amongst Muslim youth with other cohorts and begin to get a slightly better understanding. So why is this important for schools? And I know that the rest of the morning we will be speaking a lot about this, but I couldn't help. I just wanted to begin to start some of these discussions for us all. Was that when we're thinking about the development of young people, a large proportion of the time that they spend, a large proportion of the experiences and the exposures where they begin to form social interactions are in the school environment. When we're thinking about their development during this period of time, not only are they developing with regards to their identity, but also their independence, their peer relationships, their schemas for future interactions with the environments and the support systems, all sort of identifying and highlighting the importance of the role that school environments play in the development of mental health for young people. We know that poor mental health is particularly associated with poor academic attainment, lower levels of employability, and like I mentioned earlier, in terms of mortality rates and general quality of life. So that being said, schools could potentially play an important role when we're thinking about trying to support young people and get a better understanding. So just a few things to think about, and I'm sure some of the other speakers will begin to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but maybe thinking about integration. So I mentioned earlier that some of the vulnerabilities is the fact that Muslim young people belong to a heterogeneous group. So they are constantly having this battle in terms of acculturation with their heritage culture, so being British Muslim, but also the culture of the mainstream society in which they live in. So trying to develop and integrate more integration and cultural engagement within school environments. Enhancing friendship quality and peer support is also quite important as well when we're thinking about well-being. There's, again, a plethora of literature which suggests that social support, in particular from peers, is important when it comes to supporting the well-being of young people. And also having quite clear policies with regards to what is identified as faith-based discrimination. What are some of the common values and of respect and tolerance that we should be engaging in and encouraging in our schools? And then lastly, beginning to introduce school teachers to the concepts and challenges of cultural identity and acculturation. So it's complex, and this is just a beginning to sort of start some of those conversations. But if anything I could say at this point would just be the fact that we really, really, really need to have good, solid data where we can then begin to tease apart some of these intricacies and begin to understand exactly what some of these developmental trajectories and profiles look like when it comes to the mental health of young Muslim people. And I think at that, I am going to stop. I hope I haven't overrun in terms of time, and open it back up to everybody else.
Thank you, Dr. Sania. That was an excellent presentation, a real deep dive into data, and great to see that actually we're looking at some of those solutions and approaches that people across sectors working with young people, young Muslim people, can certainly think about. So thank you. We will hold for questions. Please do use the Q&A. I would like to open, use the chat room, please. I will open up the Q&A after another two speakers, and we're short of time, so do use the chat room. Anyone who has joined us in the last 10-15 minutes or so, please do introduce yourself over the chat room. And I'd like to now introduce our next speaker. So previously an award-winning advanced skills teacher and Harvard author, techno teachers, Nick Ponsford is now a recognized EdTech thought leader and frequent keynote speaker. Nick currently works with a range of organizations, including Leeds Beckett University, Microlink, EdTech UK, and is studying for a doctorate in education. She's the founder of the multi-award winning Global Equality Collective. Since launching last year, it has reached out to hundreds of schools and colleges across 20 plus countries, impacting 170,000 students globally. Thank you, Nick, for joining us today. Really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much. I feel very humbled by the introduction as well. I'm just going to try and share my screen. So if you wouldn't mind bearing with me, please, everyone. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see that okay? Fantastic. So my name's Nick Ponsford and I am the founder of the Global Equality Collective. So my background is that I worked in schools. I was a secondary school teacher. I went up through the ranks quite quickly. I won a teaching award and became an advanced skills teacher, which you may know means that I did outreach work. So I then went from working with secondaries on inclusion to then working with early years through to post-16. So I did that for about 10 years. And then after that, when I had my first son, I was told I couldn't be a senior leader and stay in school. So I came out and worked with an educational charity called Achievement for All, which looked at closing the gap for the least attaining 20% of students. And essentially, working with them for 9 years, I really felt that we had a problem with hyper diversity when it comes to education. And so I've done a couple of things out of that. So the first thing is I'm actually a doctorate candidate. I am looking at intersectionality in education at the moment. So listening to a last speaker, it was absolutely amazing. I agree. I've just done my literature review. There is barely any intersectional educational research in the country at the moment. It will go maybe 2 or 3 deep in terms of filters, and that's kind of where it ends. So I see this as a huge opportunity of what we can do to produce incredible research to help move our education system forwards with this. The next thing I did was look at how we could improve inclusion, and that's why I think it's really important for schools to have these conversations which link in different intersectionality approaches, and also the hyper diversity, as said, with comments in the chat about cognitive diversity, which is known as neurodiversity as well. But this is hard. And this is kind of a problem that we have in the education system at the moment, where we've got time poor teachers who are passionate, where we've got a lack of funding. And as you can see with the data, we are in a crisis. However, I like to keep a positive spin on things, and crisis normally bring change. And that's what I've been trying to do. So what I've looked at as we kind of zoom out is, why is this so difficult? What can we do to support students, and in particular Muslim children, when it comes to feeling a sense of belonging, of feeling a sense of inclusion, and feeling safe when they go into our schools and colleges? And I think part of a problem that we have in education at the moment is that we feel that the problems are too big. And one of the issues that we have is because it is too big. When we look at the Equality Act on its own, we can see that there are 9 protected characteristics, but actually the issues that we have in school do relate to things like neurodiversity, mental health, and there's a whole spectrum around when people might want to focus on one area, say religion or say age. Actually, there is a whole, I call it the Kaplunk model, the retro game with straws and marbles. There's lots of different things that we need to unpack. And for a mainstream school teacher with a lack of training in this, and also a lack of lived experience potentially, this becomes sort of insurmountable of what they can do. But I really do believe that we can help schools with this, and we can provide a solution. And essentially that's what I've been looking at with the GEC. So the Global Equality Collective, the GEC.education, and we're at GEC Collect on social media. We've got 2 solutions for this. And on the basis of what we've just heard as well, we have the statistics out there. We know it's dire. We know that we need to do something. So how do we drive that action? So one of the things that we need to do is look at how we build in that support and that expertise, particularly into schools that don't have this already. So we've created a collective of subject matter experts which cover those global equality characteristics that you've just seen, but also they illustrate the wide variety of personalities, people's viewpoints, attitudes and values when it comes to different marginalised groups, and also the intersectionality of those as well. So one of the things we can do is help organisations like schools and colleges by speaking to those grassroots groups, the authors, the academics, the people that are out there who are making those changes, the people that want to make schools the experts too, because one of the issues we do have in education is a very outdated system of teacher training where D&I is being done at schools, and actually the focus really is a bit more on selling management programs or upselling products rather than trying to change the system that we've got and make it an inclusive, fixed term inclusion is really what I'm after in schools. The second part that we've created as part of this is a GEC platform. So the GEC platform is the world's first intersectional platform that helps with schools getting their data, coaching recommendations and training. And this is the first way that education system has been able to look at an intersectional response, which is what I feel is really needed with this, for schools to really understand how they can destigmatize Muslim identity culture, how they can create a joined up approach to tackling phobic beliefs like Islamophobia, and actually trying to look at these situations which are very complicated, very stressful, that cause a lot of fear and anxiety for everyone involved, and actually create positive pathways for our students, which is what we want to do. And I'm really excited, and I don't have enough time to say it about today, but we're about to launch our student surveys. These will be the first intersectional surveys which will be able to look at religion, mental health, number of parents in the family, social economic status, that huge hyperdiversity that we have of our students, and help schools really focus their attention and close gaps where they need to make our ordinary classrooms extraordinarily inclusive for our students as well. So because I know that we are a little bit up for time, I'm actually going to stop there, but I would love to talk about this more in the breakout works, and please see our website and our socials for more information. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. I can see that obviously the chat room is thriving. I know, Nick, you've also put your details down, so please do reach out to GEC if you've got any kind of further questions or would like to get involved. So our next speaker is Sufian Sadiq. He's the Director of Teaching School at Children Learning Trust. and he has the responsibility of overseeing 2 regional hub areas in the southeast of England. He's passionate activist within the educational landscape around race, equity and inclusion, a fellow and board member of the Chartered College of Teaching, as well as a fellow for the Chartered Institute of Educational Assessors. Over to you, Sufian.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sabah, for the introduction and the opportunity to be on this. First of all, I think it's incredibly important that we're having this conversation. It's equally important because a lot of the time what we forget is that in certain elements, in certain communities, in certain faiths, religion plays a variable part on people's lives. With Islam, what we know is that religion plays quite a significant part in a majority of Muslims' life. That's not to say that there's variance in people's practicing of the faith, their adherence of the faith, or their consciousness of God, or whatever it may be, however we may term it. What we know is that there is a clear variance in how we see this faith element, but culturally coming from a background, so Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, whether it's Somalia, these are countries where even the culture has been impacted significantly over centuries by Islam and the faith element, and therefore their cultural practices, from the way they eat, from the way they behave, are all shaped and molded from deeply held Islamic values, Islamic traditions, Islamic beliefs. And often we sometimes find ourselves in challenging situations in schools where schools, and probably more so again, assuming the fact that we've got challenges within the system. So the system, we have a lack of diversity at the top table in education. The latest kind of NFER research shows not only is there a lack of diversity, when I'm talking about diversity, I'm talking about the fact that there's faith and ethnic minorities at the very top. So the vast majority of the top of headship and leaders in schools are made up of Christian, non-faith. If you're looking at the percentages that are made up of those from the Islamic faith, representative of the student population that's within the system, there's absolutely no comparisons to that. The issue where we are faced with from a Muslim perspective, rather than even the diversity and equity perspective, is that the assumption thereby is that we will look at this notion of education of young people and young Muslim people exactly the way we would look at the education of all children. And that's okay, whereby when we're thinking about the importance of imparting knowledge, we're talking about pedagogical practices, we're talking about school improvement strategies. What do children need to know? How do they know more? How do they remember more? It all makes sense. However, what we now have into the mix is a real mental health crisis within our system. So the knowledge aspect, perhaps it's fair to say that actually there's very little need to have a deeper appreciation of people's backgrounds and their faiths. But when you then throw into the mix the whole child, and that's the important part here, the whole child, what you can't do is separate the child as in their academic ability and forget everything else a child comes into our schools with. The whole child, the faith element then becomes an overlapping element, an element that actually dictates a significant part of their day-to-day life, of their interactions, of their experiences, of what it's like to process grief, what it's like to process difficulties. Very clear example, I walked into a school only a couple of days ago, but a child had gone through a bereavement and staff were talking to the child about he should draw pictures of his loved ones. And he couldn't draw pictures because from the Islamic tradition, that was something that's not encouraged, especially of faces of people. So that element was misunderstood in that process of trying to support that whole child. Then it was looking at, let's look at music therapy for this child. Well, actually, music therapy is something, again, from a faith element, it's an element where the vast majority of scholars within Islam would say actually music, especially in the form that we see it today, is something that's discouraged. And therefore, you suddenly have a child that you're trying to support within your system with a huge disconnect in our understanding of how can we support them, their mental health in schools. So I kind of almost want to look at this in a way that I want to kind of approach this is, one, understanding the fact that Islamophobia has to be appreciated and understood as a trigger for mental health issues and challenges young people are facing. The lack of education that we have in our schools, especially with the Muslim makeup of significant minority, the challenges around young people being able to practice elements of their faith and do so in safe spaces is proving to be incredibly difficult. There are still many schools that don't understand the concept of the fact that many children, many young people would like to practice their faith and want to take part in prayer. There's no allowances made for people to be able to pray within school. There's no spaces, safe spaces for them to be able to perform their obligatory prayers within school. There's a lack of understanding around the fact that if we've got things like very open toilets, mixed toilets at the moment, but again, a lack of understanding and appreciation around the process to pray and the evolution that takes place before that prayer, what the impact of that is that females now suddenly feel extremely marginalized because they can't do certain things. So they can't wash up for prayer because they're unable to take the hijab off because there's open communal mixed toilets and so on and so forth. Now, there's a place for all of these things. And it's not to say that suddenly we go, and we're saying because we don't do it as Muslims, therefore nobody should have any of these things. I think the importance is to understand, by sometimes going down the road of equity and going down the road of being equal, being diverse, being open, being more liberal, and trying to support wider groups, are we by default sometimes marginalizing certain groups without knowing we're doing that? Are we by default almost discriminating against certain groups and making it difficult for them to be able to go about their daily lives? So one element is schools do need to be aware of the faith element. The faith element dictates a significant part of people's lives. And increasingly young Muslims are feeling less confidence about the expressive elements of their faith, which is very expressing in its form, in the fact that females may choose to adopt a hijab, men may choose to grow a beard, that you can see if somebody is a Muslim or not a Muslim. So understanding in schools and the knowledge in schools, there is a deficit. Often we almost synonymize being Pakistani means that we understand about faith, or because we've done some research about Bangladeshis, that means that we understand about Islam. So I think understanding about Islam is incredibly important. We run an organization in Luton called Discover Islam. And a part of our work is actually we go and do assemblies in school, teacher training in school, absolutely no charge, but it's about giving people a very basic understanding of what is Islam. The number of teachers that serve in schools where there's populations like Luton's or Bradford or Leicester or Birmingham and still are unable to articulate what are the basic elements of their faith. The problem with that is, how do you build rapport with a young person where we have such disconnect with understanding elements of their faith, understanding what dictates and runs their life, understanding what pressures are they perhaps feeling at home, what are the expectations at home, when we just have such a deficit of prior knowledge around the faith element. School's an incredibly important place to have the mental health conversations about faith. And I think schools are doing great work around mental health and having the conversation. So we're in a crisis, which we know. We are in a crisis that's a funding crisis as well. We accept that in schools. There's not enough money, not enough resource given to mental health. The third point probably is we've not come to terms with accepting that talking about mental health means we can talk about faith. We've actually made a conscious effort to say we'll talk about mental health and sexuality, because we understand that's an aspect of the intersectionality that perhaps dictates and affects their mental health. So teachers understand that if a young person is going through a decision and choices in life, they understand that it's important to understand sexuality plays a part of their mental health. But teachers lack confidence within the system to either discuss or engage with the importance of faith and how faith plays a crucial part in the mental health or the solution to their mental health and the problems that they face within schools. In terms of the challenges, how can schools support young people? And I think that's the question I really want to get across before I finish, is training and development of staff around Islam. You can't talk about the faith, you can't consider the faith, you can't genuinely provide support to a young person where faith is such a strong element in their life without understanding that. Do we start that with whole staff? I would say at least let's start it with the front-facing, the mental health first aiders, those that are going to be dealing with the fallout. So your school counselors, your pastoral teams, your heads of year that are dealing constantly with emotions, and that pastoral care responsibility sits with them. Do they need to understand what the faith is, the elements of the faith that allow young people, and also allow educators to adopt and to be able to talk about? Wouldn't that help you? I often find that Ramadan is coming and I'm perpetually sick of people. Whenever Ramadan comes, everyone says it's just to know how poor people feel. And from the Islamic faith, we say, actually, if God wanted us to know how poor people feel, we would be poor. We'd have that test in our life. But actually, Ramadan's so much about self-discipline and self-control. And how can we take the lessons that Ramadan gives in compliance within schools and behavior in schools? I was at one of our schools was going through inspection, and there was Friday prayers during that inspection. And the head teacher observed the Friday prayers, and he said, I'm absolutely astonished because the Friday prayers happen in a large prayer space. He's been in and been past, but he said, I've tracked some of our most difficult boys go into the prayer just to make sure that they don't go off anywhere. They've all gone into prayer and they've all prayed. And he said, what astonished me was they were silent during the sermon. They didn't move during the sermon. They all were absolutely in sync, stood in a dead straight line where there is no line, and they've made the line. And they've done the prayer and completed the prayer exactly how it should be done. He said the problem is they then choose to be defiant in other areas because they clearly know how to be compliant, and clearly faith is an element which drives the compliance for them. They want to behave in that moment in time because they're self-regulating their behavior because of God, because they're standing before something more great. But okay, how do we now capture that self-regulation and say, if they could behave there and they could, in that moment, we're clearly lacking the inspiration to inspire them to behave for us in school in more open communal spaces, because they can do it as a collective 200 boys standing here and pray, but they're not doing it in the canteen. And do we need to revisit some of those things? And I think that element of how can we take in schools the faith as a lever, as an inspiration to help young people become more compliant. We need to use less of using the faith as a stick in schools. I've seen teachers talk about, well, throw in that element of, well, every now and then somebody's had really bad behavior, but you should be ashamed as a Muslim. That's probably not the right time. And we know around mental health, it's about reinforcement of the positives. It's about promoting the good work that people do. So if you're not talking about the faith element in the good terms, in the good times, there's no point now drawing and blaming everything on the faith when things go wrong. So I would say thinking about that element is incredibly important. And I would say actually faith plays an absolutely pivotal role in their mental health and well-being, and therefore conversations that need to be had need to be able to. I looked at something the other day where there was characteristics, personality types, and the personality types were linked to Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. And for those in the Islamic heritage and faith, they would be able to relate to that. Actually, I'm displaying a characteristic. I shouldn't be worried about that. I'm displaying something and my behaviors are like Umar Khattab radiallahu anha. How can I now behave and regulate that passion, that strength, that enthusiasm for me wanting to really get things done now and get them sorted now? And I want to address them. I want to fix them with my hands immediately. How do I channel that effort and how do I use that inspiration of Umar Khattab radiallahu anha to try and challenge that in that young person? How do I say to the young person actually who's perhaps lacking the confidence to be a big prolific speaker and go in as a big strapping lad, to say actually Abu Bakr radiallahu anha was like this, and how can we take inspiration from his character and kindness? So there's lots that we can take from faith that brings richness, and that doesn't necessarily mean we compromise a secular nature of our schools, sanctity of. I'm not asking schools to become faith schools. I'm saying to schools, use faith as a lever to get the outcomes you want from your young people, to give them experiences you want them to feel while they're in school, and to allow them to develop their mental health and resilience in a way that will absolutely support them for a conducive learning experience and environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sufian. So, I mean, part of the issue in identifying the mental health problems existing in Muslim communities and centering the impact and salience of mental health in diagnostics and treatment is that faith isn't broadly recognised in the mental health sector, in how data is being recorded or in considerations around treatment. While the Muslim community is by no means monolithic, Islam is a universal thread that binds us all together as a community, particularly in terms of developing better coping mechanisms, more resilience, and how it can be leveraged in therapeutic methods. So as a community that's overwhelmingly from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, Muslims are sometimes more likely to suffer from mental illnesses such as anxiety disorder, depression, psychosis, as well as being detained under the Mental Health Act. Despite this, fewer people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds seek treatments, and overall, they achieve poorer results. Muslim youth in particular are also less likely to access CAMS, as previously mentioned, and research has also shown us the kind of unease and nervousness in which practitioners approach Muslim families. I'm conscious of time, and I know that we have some questions, which I would like to ask both of you, but I may need to defer that to the end, only to see how much time is left. If not, I have made note of those questions, and obviously with the speaker's permissions, I'll be able to email that perhaps and then attach it in the kind of the post-event comms. So bear with me for those of you who have asked some really interesting questions. I want to bring in our other speakers just because we've got two other people to speak before we go into the breakout room. So just bear with me. I am going to now introduce our next speaker. Okay, so our next speaker is Carolyn, who is an integrative therapist and Place to Be's Deputy Regional Clinical Lead, supporting Place to Be's school-based projects in London and the West of England. She has been with Place to Be for 13 years as a clinical supervisor and a school project manager. Place to Be has been providing mental health support in schools for over 25 years and is now working in over 700 schools nationwide. Thank you, Caroline, for joining us, and feel free to share screen if you've got a presentation.
Thank you. Just share my screen. Can everyone see that? Yep. Yes, thanks for the introduction, Sabah. Yeah, it's a privilege to be part of this discussion. Some really interesting points, a lot of interesting research and thinking and practice going on. So my part of this is to kind of think a little bit about effective therapeutic tools in the educational setting. So my experience is very much school-based, and I've been kind of embedded in a range of different schools over 11 years, delivering mental health projects. So I'm going to talk about some of the ideas which I think will feed into this idea of a toolkit being developed, and thinking about what is the most effective way of embedding a toolkit within schools. So I'm going to just look briefly at a kind of, it's a very practical focus for this presentation. So thinking about the whole school approach, where there is a lot of evidence that that is the most effective way of messaging in schools. Giving some examples of Place to Be's engagement with working with staff and parents, and of, for example, Children's Mental Health Week. And then Sabah asked me to talk a little bit about myth busting and the kind of messages that we're seeing in schools about how people understand mental health. So Place to Be's approach has been very much moving from originally offering just one-to-one mental health support in schools to now offering a much more whole school approach. So we've been supporting children and young people, as well as supporting school staff, working with senior leaders and supporting parents and carers. So we're offering we've got presence in about 700 schools across the country at the moment. So we have mental health professionals in schools supporting staff to think a little bit about what students might be communicating, working with students. We offer services such as lunchtime drop-ins, where students can come and talk to a mental health professional about difficulties that they come across. We're involved in a lot of safeguarding cases and work with parents, as well as offering kind of digital support tools. So I just would like to share some of those experiences to, you know, develop the thinking a little bit about best ways of developing a toolkit. So people have already mentioned about schools being amazing places for actually reaching out to a lot of children and young people. And I think there is a lot of amazing work going on to destigmatize talking about mental health. I think it's much more normalized now in schools. That it is okay to talk about mental health. And I think if with a whole school approach and understanding specific school communities, it becomes possible to consider the cultural and religious factors that are unique to different schools, and the different origins and heritage of the students, and building relationships, not just with individual children, but with their families, with their carers, with the school staff, and kind of knowing the local area. So a combination of being able to get to know the unique school context, as well as getting to know individual students. And then if a mental health intervention is offered, doing a very rigorous assessment and formulation for each individual child to get a sense of their unique difficulties and presenting issues. So our experience is kind of echoed by the NICE guidelines at the moment, which from 2022 recommend a whole school approach, which they define as working with the entire school community as a single unit, involving coordinated action between 3 components. So coordinating with the teaching and learning component, working with the whole school ethos and environment, as well as working with families and having partnerships with the community. So that's the current NICE guidelines about promoting mental well-being in primary and secondary schools. Sabah asked me to talk a little bit about myths. So I've taken some information from a Children's Society survey in 2021, as well as just anecdotally really what I think we're seeing in schools at the moment, some of the myths around mental health. So we're hearing, he's just talking about his difficulties to get attention. She's fine, she's doing well at school and she has lots of friends. He doesn't need anyone else to help. We're coping as a family. He's fine. I've never seen him get angry or hurt anyone. And then anecdotally, it'll bring shame on the family if I tell you about my difficulties. I shouldn't have these thoughts. My faith should be enough. If I tell you what's making me anxious, it'll get worse because you'll tell other people. So obviously a lot of things then, and that's not specific to the Muslim faith, but just thinking about intersectional issues and being heterogeneous. I think we're seeing a lot of these kind of barriers to people accessing mental health services in schools. So thinking about developing some key messages for a toolkit based on these myths, rather than dismissing behaviour as attention seeking, looking at behaviour as communication, looking at behaviour as connection seeking, rather than thinking that we will see that somebody's struggling to function if they have mental health issues. Let's kind of psychoeducate about the different presentations of mental health issues, especially where children and young people might be internalising a problem, and you know the many reasons why they might not be actually talking about it or showing. Often it's a young girl sitting quietly in the corner of the classroom who isn't drawing attention to herself and might get missed. But let's kind of notice where there might be internalising presentations. Messaging about it's brave, it's courageous to admit that you're struggling and to seek help. So again, you know, what's already been mentioned earlier about kind of positive strengths-based approach to that. I think there's a need for a lot more psychoeducation about the counselling profession, and that there is work within strict boundaries of confidentiality, a strict code of ethics, not giving advice, and that young people are encouraged to set their own goals in counselling. I mean, there's a lot of difficulties around that. It's not always as straightforward, and it's really depressing to hear about the access issues and kind of misconceptions or difficulties people are having with accessing that. But thinking about strengths-based and promoting positive messages. And then looking at how people are often feeling quite afraid and nervous about their feelings and addressing them and moving away from them and using distraction, actually looking at feelings as a kind of positive, like moving towards them. Feelings can help us to figure out our relationship with our faith. You know, a lot of young people today kind of, when they're struggling with identity issues, using their feelings as a guide to help them think, well, you know, for example, in my relationship to loss and grief, is that an area where my faith is a real protective factor, is a real strength, and kind of supporting young people with that. So that fits with the NICE guidelines, again, about promoting a non-judgmental strengths-based approach. So focusing on self-worth, supporting our young people with skills and promoting resilience. Just very quickly, some of the work that Place to Be is already doing in schools around kind of toolkits and kind of educating the school workforce with mental health awareness. Place to Be has a Mental Health Champions Foundation programme, which anyone working in schools can access for free. It's been accessed by over 67,000 school staff. So I suppose thinking about kind of delivery partners and looking at what's already out there and how messaging specific to kind of specific issues can be kind of targeted through existing programmes. This is the kind of work that is going on at the moment. We've also got a senior mental health leads training programme, which again has reached out at the moment to almost 1,000 school leaders. And this is one which takes about over 3 months. It's a kind of dedicated programme with different levels of engagement, consultations, support groups. And this is a way that we found has been quite an effective way of accessing the school leadership team and bringing them on board to kind of mental health messaging. Place to Be also has a parent partnership programme. So we have family practitioners embedded in schools, also promoting kind of Parenting Smart, which is an online training programme for parents to kind of look at parenting capacity issues. And then there's a app, Parenting Smart, where people can dip into kind of individual parenting tips that have come out of data that we've gathered from schools about difficulties. that just kind of links really to, I think we've found it really helpful having somebody based in schools to help deliver these messages and kind of find out what issues are coming up within which communities. I just wanted to mention the Children's Mental Health Week, which is, I find a campaign is a really, really powerful way of reaching the whole school community. And for example, Children's Mental Health Week every year generates a huge amount of interest. Celebrities, politicians, decision makers. It's a really powerful opportunity for children's voice to be heard as well. And it's a kind of multi-pronged approach to psychoeducation. It's quite creative. It stimulates a lot of debate. So I know that there's going to be discussion later about the most effective way of implementing a toolkit into schools. Personally, I find that a kind of weekly campaign like Children's Mental Health Week is a great way of like generating that kind of interest, and it snowballs as well because other organisations and schools make their own resources. So I think that's something I would definitely kind of feel really positive about. I know that there has been some work with the kind of Kidscape, I think, on Anti-Bullying Week and Islamophobia Awareness Week. So I think, you know, that the kind of energy that's generated around those can be really positive. So finally, just some kind of key tips, I suppose, about engaging school staff, which is, you know, kind of the area that Place to Be has worked in for many years. There's a lot of evidence to show that working with the whole school approach is really effective. So thinking about a toolkit which reaches the curriculum, the school ethos and the whole community. Thinking about the importance of engaging school leaders, creating lesson plans which are specific to the community of each particular school, flagging the success of annual campaigns, and one which Place to Be hasn't been involved in, but personally I find it's a really powerful way of reaching out to schools, is some kind of quality mark or some kind of award. I know that the UNICEF Rights Respecting Schools Award generates a lot of interest, and it has an accompanying website, there's resources, there's e-learning. Schools can progress from a kind of bronze to a gold level award, so they revisit it each year. And I think, you know, the schools are very proactive in signing up to those kind of things. They pay a small fee. They can evidence their achievements to parents and to Ofsted when they've kind of got their award. So I think that that's quite a powerful and quite a sustainable tool for reaching out to schools. So thank you for listening. That's just a very small nugget of kind of some practical ways of developing a toolkit, and I really look forward to contextualising that in the discussion going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And it's great to obviously have Place to Be as part of our membership. So really looking forward to seeing how we can build out with some of our objectives in this area. Particularly your last slide really helps open up, I think, the content and discussions we hope to have in the second breakout session. So thank you so much. And our next speaker is Kerry. Kerry, I'm sorry, we're only giving you about 5 minutes left until we need to go into the breakout rooms, but Kerry is a teacher experienced in working with vulnerable children through a range of roles, co-developing policy and practice at Haringey Virtual School to significantly increase inclusion and attainment. Kerry led on the development of attachment-aware, trauma-informed practice, and in 2016 she moved into public health and set up the Anchor approach to further develop and apply these principles at population level, working across education, health, children's services and third sector organisations. Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you. It's such a privilege to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I don't know, can you see my screen? I'm not used to using Zoom, so I've shared my slide, but I don't know whether you can see it. Can you see it?
Are you able to share screen on your side?
That's what I'm trying to do now, but I'm not sure whether it's come up. Has it come up or not?
Not yet, no.
No, let me try again. So I'm not used to oh, there you go. Right, can you see it now?
Yes.
Fantastic. Got it now?
Yes.
Is it? Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, it's just lovely to be here today. And I'm the strategic lead for the Anchor approach in Haringey, and we've been working since we started doing this work, developing it in 2010, and then took it into public health in 2016. And I'm a teacher, and we started working with doing this work with children in care, and then moved it into, because we wanted to kind of impact at population level. So the Anchor approach, what is it? It's a highly innovative program, and the approach is being used by children's services in Haringey to support resilience, wellbeing and mental health. It's evidence-based, it's cutting edge, and not currently available elsewhere. We've developed everything, co-developed it with schools and other parts of the system as well. Meets government aims for resilience, wellbeing and mental health. It provides a common language and approach that's straightforward and accessible, particularly for parents. We wanted that from the start. It's used across phases and sectors to reinforce messaging, you know, sort of so that different professional groups are reinforcing a common message across all the systems. So it's delivered by frontline staff to maximise the impact of existing relationships, build capacity within the community, and create sustainability. And it facilitates attachment aware trauma-informed practice at frontline. So it's co-developed. So we've filled gaps that schools and other parts of the system have said are a difficulty. It's very practical, and there's an element of it that supports recovery from trauma, and we've had some real successes with that. So we focus on particularly building an understanding. We work with staff predominantly to build an understanding of attachment trauma, impulsivity, shame and rage, trust, communication styles to support emotion regulation, and sensory means of emotion regulation as well, approach to withdrawal drives and emotion friendly limit setting, and also looking at physiological changes in the body. And the reason for focusing on those areas particularly is that we would really like adults working with children and young people to be able to reflect on their own behaviours and the impact they're having on the relationships they have, so that they're able to really maximise on the relationships that they have already. So we're really coming at it from a relationship point of view, and really thinking about how can we support adults who are working with children on a daily basis to improve their understanding of resilience and well-being, and use that to impact on their relationships. So what it does, where we work in health, I won't read it all because we haven't got very much time, but you can read it there. It's really about helping to support staff at frontline across the health service to make every contact count, and to really increase stimulatory environments for children to reach their neurodevelopmental potential and to be school ready, really. And we work across education settings, children's services and third sector to facilitate emotion regulation, and that's, you know, sort of some of the things how we do it. Build resilience and well-being using traditional cultures, research, Maslow and others. And we're particularly use the Circle of Courage work that was developed by other psychologists in America, and we look to meeting developmental needs and identify unmet needs as well, so that staff look more at sort of what the young people are communicating, and how do we look at what unmet needs are being communicated through their behaviours. Reframe perceptions of behaviour, and so that adults started to view behaviours differently and respond more positively to that. And also thinking about policies and systems, because sometimes there are unintended consequences through policy and systems, bringing about change first of all in adults' behaviour, then policies and systems, so that in the longer term children and young people are able to adapt their behaviours as well. We really look I mentioned shame earlier on. I think shame drives so much of the behaviour for young people and for adults in schools, and I think it's particularly difficult and we talk to adults in a front line about some of the behaviours that we might see where somebody's having is triggered into a shame response very regularly, and talk about their early experience, and if they've experienced significant racial inequality and been perceived as less than others because of their religion or their race or their colour, then surely it's a normal response to hear judgment in adult responses where without that experience they might not. So that adults respond more sympathetically and helpfully to those young people and understand where those behaviours are coming from, alongside giving them strategies to manage. It's not about not engaging with it. It's about how to engage with it in a way that's helpful. And so we've had a lot of success, sort of in working in that way. And some of that work we do is supporting complex cases. And so we help schools and other settings to sort of apply the thinking to children with more complex needs, so that they help, helps them to understand how to apply the thinking. So it goes across all those sectors. It's universal in health, and we like to use the thinking about targeted universalism, where in Haringey there's a large discrepancy between the east and the west of the borough, and so we've got a pilot in the east of the borough at North Middlesex Hospital to support that early work in health. And in education settings, you can see there is universal and targeted because of the network meetings that we have to help them apply the work with more complex children and need. And then, of course, there's targeted work in children's services and third sector as well. And so that's the reach of the work. And in terms of tools and resources for schools, sort of following on from what Carolyn was saying about the whole school approach and how we've been using a whole school approach since from the outset, and we're really happy that now the government is really kind of driving that work as well. In terms of school systems, we look at behaviour and sort of have a behaviour and relationship model policy for schools to use, and we work with schools to think about how to sort of make that their own in line with their practice. Emotionally friendly school review that we're just about to finish, so that schools can look at sort of through an attachment and trauma lens where their school's at, and think about that and use it for Ofsted. In terms of supporting child wellbeing, the universal element, we have assemblies for wellbeing that have gone out to primary schools, and we're starting to work with secondaries soon, so we want to do some more work in secondaries. And we've also got some philosophy for wellbeing lessons that are linked to the assemblies and promote critical thinking skills. And what we want to go on to do is to use those lessons as a core and build additional lessons that that schools can use to think about other more sort of complex areas around prevent, and working with those teams in the borough around violence against women and girls, around exploitation and gangs, and using and hoping that the work that we're doing around helping children be more critical in their thinking about their resilience and their well-being and their wider world, that they can use that and apply that to those more complex areas that they're in. And so it's targeted work. We've developed a resilience indicator and strategy tool to help schools and other professionals use the work that we're doing to have an assessment of where children are at and what their needs are, what they're communicating. And we're piloting that now actually in schools to see how to use that and ask schools whether it works and what we can improve with that. Supporting staff wellbeing, so there's a staff wellbeing toolkit, and we want all of these resources to align so that one supports the other. There's training, whole staff core training with additional meeting staff workshops that we're working on currently, and 10-minute staff warmers as well. And 2 case studies that show the sustainability of the work and some of the recovery that I mentioned from trauma. There was, sort of case study A was a young man in year 4 when we first met him without an education healthcare plan. It was in 2017, and he was very high risk of exclusion. And so when we started working with him, the school set up once we started working with the school, a mentoring program that used music and piano actually, and he learned to play the piano. And so there was an almost immediate reduction in incidences in class and around the school, and no in-class support was required when he moved to year 6, when he did significant support before, and he transitioned into mainstream secondary school, and is still in school actually. He's in year 11 now, and in 2021 he came back to the school and talked to the school about, you know, sort of the secret of his success, and played the piano with the Royal Academy. And he was a young man who was very high risk of gang affiliation. Came back to the primary school in year 7, very fearful because he was being pressurised to join a group, and he had family links to you know, sort of really significant links to gangs in the borough. And so you know, sort of it's great that he's still in school, and we're happy because there's a bit of a spike in Haringey as children and young people move into secondary, where children who may be contained at primary, you know, sort of become excluded very quickly in secondary. So I won't read this because I think we haven't got time, but you can quickly see, you know, Mum is very happy about that, that he settled, and attributed it to our work actually in the school.
Thank you so much.
I will stop there because I've got time. Yeah, I don't know if you want to share the
yes.
Slide deck. There is